We finally have the full lines for us out there per Las Vegas, the betting capital, the football capital of the world. All right. So we are breaking down each position: quarterback, wide receiver, running back, tight end, in terms of what Vegas is telling us about the upcoming fantasy football season. I think this had been our most popular video up to date this summer. So I wanted to do a part 2 of it. All right. And that's what this is. And I'll tell you what, the very first thing that Vegas is telling us is that Travis Kelce not going to have a great week 1. You know why? Because Underdog Fantasy has him set at 0.5 receiving yards for week 1, all right? They just want to get you on the platform. They are giving you an absolutely free square for this first game, all right? Travis Kelce, half a receiving yard on Underdog Fantasy. It is quite literally free money, all right? So go download the Underdog Fantasy app. It's the first link down below. Use code BDGE when you get on there. You're going to get a big deposit bonus. You get that Travis Kelce free square, and you get our draft guide emailed to you absolutely free, all right? Travis Kelce, week 1, about to be a movie. Let's talk quarterbacks. So basically what I did was this. Underdog obviously does best ball drafts, and they have ADP from people that are drafting in paid money leagues. Every draft that's done on Underdog is a buy-in league. So the ADP is relatively sharp, but now they have the lines out, the pick'em lines for players' season-long statistics. So we have receptions for a lot of players. We have passing yards, rushing yards, touchdowns, or whatever. So what I did, I took these hands. I got into the garden, right? And I manually calculated out, based on the season-long stats that they have for these players, the fantasy points of all of the players available, right? And they don't have every single player. They don't have every single stat for every player, but I did my best to grab every player that they do have and then calculate out their stats for season long and compare them to ADP and see where the biggest discrepancies are and just overall differences that we see from fantasy ADP to what Vegas is actually telling us in terms of what we can be in store for this year. So when we break down the list, which we'll put up on the screen, there's not a big discrepancy in the top 4. Allen, Mahomes, Hurts, Lamar Jackson all have 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of fantasy points, and they are 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of Underdog ADP. No real surprise there. And if you go on Underdog Fantasy to look at these pick'em lines, some of the quarterbacks don't have rushing yards. So what I did was give them hopefully a practical, realistic number that I can go by. Like, I don't know that Mahomes had one, but I looked at like his last 3 years and they were all similar. So I gave him those statistics, and anyone who's like non-rushing quarterback, I gave him like 1.5 rushing touchdowns. Anyone who's a little bit up, maybe I gave him a boost. So I think at the end of the day, even if I'm not spot on, I'll probably be within like 10 overall fantasy points of what they're adding to their fantasy point total just from rushing alone. So I think it was relatively accurate given all the information that we have at our disposal. So the first real difference we have is Dak Prescott is calculated as having the 5th most fantasy points per Vegas, while he has the 9th ADP. And I think that's okay, because if Dak Prescott hits, he's going to have a shitload of fantasy points. This is a team that's set up to throw the ball a ton. This is a team that doesn't have any real weapons in the backfield, so they're not going to operate through the ground game. We saw post-bye last year, the Dak and CD combination. After the Week 7 bye, they were both the quarterback one and the wide receiver one in fantasy football from Week 8 to the end of the season. So he can be in for a year where he is throwing the ball a ton here, all right? I do think there's a little bit more risk with a guy like Dak involved because their offense is going to run so heavily through CeeDee Lamb. Like, if he were to go down, that offense has problems afterwards, right? Like, they got Brandon Cooks, who is a 31-year-old receiver that hasn't topped 700 yards in multiple years. Jake Ferguson's cool, but you're not running an offense through the other pieces that Dallas has outside of CeeDee Lamb. So I think there's a little bit of fragility there. There's a little bit of risk there baked in. That makes sense. But I do think people are starting to discount what his ceiling is and how good he was last year, because you have these like young, exciting, mobile quarterbacks like Anthony Richardson, who's next, CJ Stroud, who's next, Kyler Murray, who's next, are all relatively in the same space, but they're more exciting. They're younger. They're more explosive. So you get ahead of yourself, but I still think Dak is a really good value pick. The next big discrepancy we have here is Trevor Lawrence. He is the 10th ranked QB per Vegas in terms of fantasy points, but his ADP is all the way down at 16th in drafts right now. And I side, I think, more with, and it's kind of crazy, he's actually above Jordan Love for fantasy points. I think I side more so with Vegas here than I do Underdog. And I think that'll probably be the case more often than not. Like, the Underdog ADP is based on you guys drafting in the market versus Vegas. And Vegas typically right with these kind of things. So when I look at T-Law, I'm probably closer to where the fantasy points have him, where he's like right below Brock Purdy. Interestingly enough, he's right below Kyler Murray, like 6 points off in terms of fantasy points. But there is like a small, almost like a tier there where if we're going just off of guys who are within 1 fantasy point of each other per game, it goes from Anthony Richardson all the way down to Joe Burrow. So you got A-Rich, you got Stroud, you got Kyler Murray, Brock Purdy, Trevor Lawrence, Jordan Love, Joe Burrow, and then it gets to the next group of guys. But what I would say here is like, when you get into that tier, especially if you're in a 1 quarterback league, don't stress too much about these guys, because at the end of the day, it's the reason that like late round quarterback became a thing is because at the end of the day, they're going to finish within a couple, at worst, like 2.5 points per game difference over the course of the season. Like, sure, some of them have more ceiling weeks. Like Stroud and Murray probably have a better week-to-week ceiling than maybe a guy like Purdy or Trevor Lawrence or Jared Goff or whatever. But realistically, at the end of the year, there won't be that big of a difference. We do see a huge difference with Joe Burrow. He is the 12th ranked QB in terms of fantasy points on Vegas, but he is the 7th ranked in terms of underdog ADP. And that, again, is probably due to like his floor, the excitement of Joe Burrow, but clearly there's a discrepancy there between what Vegas expects him to do statistically, and maybe there's a little bit of Jamar Chase factored in with the risk there. Maybe there's a little bit of an injury risk there, but people love Joe Burrow. Now, this next tier, kind of interesting. Fantasy point wise, you have like these older veteran floor quarterbacks, Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, who are 13, 14, 15 in terms of fantasy points. And then you have who I think are more exciting, fun, explosive upside QBs in Tua, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, where they're below them in terms of Vegas fantasy points, but above them in terms of underdog ADP. And this is one situation where I actually probably lean closer to underdog ADP because I like the weekly upside there. If you are in a 1 quarterback league, you're not really shooting for floor. Like, you don't want Aaron Rodgers as your 1 quarterback league guy, right? Because there's going to be others available on the waiver wire. If he can't hit a ceiling, then you could always drop him and replace him with a guy like Jaden Daniels or whatever. So I lean more towards the ADP there, but they are telling you something, man. When you look at the fantasy point numbers, like, there is a reason, again, that Vegas stays in business, and it's because they are really accurate with predicting and like weighing the risk versus the upside, where a lot of times when you're drafting in fantasy, like, you're only looking at upside and you're hoping that it hits. And I think that's a good way to play, but I also think you could learn a lot from hopefully Vegas acting as like bumpers for y'all. Let's move to the running back position. Now, this was a different angle that I took, given that they only have like reception lines for like the top 6 or 7 running backs. So without having like a clear baseline for their fantasy point numbers via receptions, you can't get an accurate fantasy point total. So I just wanted to look at the rushing touchdown lines and see where we were at here. And as you can see by the chart, we only have 6 running backs that have a rushing touchdown line above 7.5. So you have Kenneth Walker at 8.5, Demont at 9.5, Kyron at 9.5, JT at 9.5, Derrick Henry at 10.5, and Christian McCaffrey at 11.5. And I actually think this is somewhere where you could take advantage of this, because I'm like, that feels like a really low number given how many touchdowns are historically just scored on the goal line. So I went back over the last like 14 years realistically, and you could see this chart, and I compiled the number of running backs each year that have scored 8 or more rushing touchdowns. And as you could see, it's typically in like the 12, 13 range. We've gotten up to 15 before. We've gotten as low as 7, but 7 was the lowest by far. That was the only year going all the way back to 2019 where it was fewer than double-digit running backs scoring 8+ rushing touchdowns. On average, as you can see, it is 12.5 running backs that score 8 or more touchdowns. And I think identifying the guys that you feel really strongly are going to have the goal line role in their offense and a relatively high scoring, like functional offense are the ones to attack that have a good chance of being above that 8 line. So I took this line on underdog, and it's Zeke higher than 5.5 rushing touchdowns, Rachaad White higher than 5.5, Zach Moss higher than 6.5, Isaiah Pacheco higher than 6.5. With those guys, I feel good that they're in good offenses, maybe outside of Rachaad White, but I see him being the complete goal line back. Like we saw it in the preseason, we saw it all last year. So he's the one where we're in a little bit of a questionable offense, but I'm actually probably most secure about his role and Isaiah Pacheco's role. Like Zeke in Dallas, he'll probably finish with 6. I think he'll have the goal line role, and this is a very high-scoring offense, obviously. Then you have Zach Moss in Cincinnati, where I think he's way more likely to be Cincinnati's goal line back than a dude like Chase Brown, who brings like a level of explosion to the offense. So as you can see here, like you've got my picks there, And again, you could follow everything that I do throughout the year if you want to track me on Pickett. But for y'all that are like getting into football season and you have a ton of different books, whether you play on Underdog or you play on, BetMGM or FanDuel or DraftKings, this app, Pickett, is fucking phenomenal because you could sync all of your sports books together. So, it's Sunday, we're in a fucking frenzy, and you've got like 75 different bets going at once. Pickett tracks all of them. It syncs all your books. You literally just like put your username in, it syncs it. The app is absolutely free. So go download it in the App Store. The link is down below. It makes your life so easy, and it tracks how well you do throughout the year. You could set it to like, let me see how I did last week. Let me see how I did last month. Let me see how I did over the course of the season. And it's got all the sports too. So if you're into NFL, MLB, NBA, this is where you need to be throughout the entire season. If you are someone who is like playing not only fantasy, but obviously if you are in like the gambling space, Pickett tracks all this stuff for you. So again, you could track me. The link down below that you use will automatically make you follow me on Pickett when you create an account. And if it asks for a code, just put in BDGE. Again, it's absolutely free. You don't have to pay anything. They're actually going to give you a free $100 or more on your account for whatever reason, but it is real. But yeah, I've taken a shitload of season-long props as well as some week one stuff. So if you want to trail me for week one, these will be updated throughout. You got Najee Harris over 8.5 receiving yards for week one. You got Josh Jacobs, his longest reception over 10.5. I think those are absolute locks because when I think about Najee Harris, we have Jaylen Warren, who's likely going to miss week one. For Najee Harris, 8.5 receiving yards, I think he would hit that even if Jaylen Warren is playing because they're going to have screens set up as an extension of their run game. And I think Najee Harris will catch 3, if not 4 passes in week one. If he can't get over 8.5 yards, then he actually is probably just Najee Harris who we thought he was. But that feels locky. Josh Jacobs, A.J. Dillon on the IR. Marshawn Lloyd has not practiced yet. He's not back from his hamstring injury. So Josh Jacobs is going to have a massive role. And I think he's a guy who's going to get heavily involved in the screen game as well and be utilized all over the formation. So 10.5 as a high reception, I felt pretty good about. If you want to take his overall receiving yards, I want to say it's like 16.5 on Underdog right now for week one against Philadelphia. So yeah, again, hop on Pickett. You could sync all your bets on there. If you want to trail my bets, I'm going to be making them all on Underdog. So again, use the code BDGE. You'll get that Travis Kelce free square. As you can see, I have not actually used the free square yet, but y'all can go use yours. And let me know what you pair it with for week one. So dialing back into the running backs, couple things that stand out to me is like they're still pretty high on Kenneth Walker when I feel like the industry's kind of low because he's had some injury riddled seasons, but he's higher than Bijan, he's higher than Breece Hall, he's higher than Josh Jacobs, he's higher than a lot of good players here. Okay, so that stands out to me. I think the discrepancy between David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs stands out to me a little bit. Demont set at 9.5 while Gibbs is set at 7.5, and the discrepancies between where people are being drafted, like Devon Achane's at 7.5, Raheem Mostert's also at 7.5, but Achane's like a 2nd round pick, Mostert's an 8th round pick. David Montgomery is a 6th, 7th round pick. Gibbs is a 1st, 2nd round pick. So like keep these things in mind. And of course, there are other factors at play here. Like Gibbs has the ceiling to catch 70 passes this year, where David Montgomery is going to catch 25 maybe, right? But like I still think it's worth looking at these lines to give yourself some practical bumpers on the bowling lane. Realistically, man, you look at like Pacheco. If you're being objective here, they have him at 6.5, where I feel like that's a lock. He did that last year in super limited games while he wasn't like the full-time back. Going into this year, pretty much will be. They had Samaje Perine, but if anything, he's going to have like a small pass catching role there. So I'm not too worried about it. But when you get down to the bottom of the list, these have been dudes that I've been worried about. Devin Singletary's, the Ramondre Stevenson's, the Zamir White's. I'm less concerned about James Cook and Alvin Kamara being down there at 4.5 rushing touchdown higher lowers because they are so involved in the passing game and they could score a ton of PPR points through receptions and receiving touchdowns, where Singletary, Stevenson, Zamir White, they can all catch passes, but I don't think they're going to have that role in their offense. I think their offense overall, where like James Cook is in Buffalo, they're going to move the ball. Kamara is just such a part of that offense that he's not really going to leave the field on 3rd downs and in passing situations. Singletary, the Giants' offense is going to be a mess. Their offensive line is still bad. Ramondre, their offensive line is still bad. Antonio Gibson is there taking work. Zamir White is a 2-down back, where these all give me like pauses for concern, and there's a reason they're going where they are. Move over to the wide receiver position, and we'll look at it the same way that we did for quarterbacks because they have reception lines up for most of the players. Now, this is not like their rank in terms of fantasy points among every wide receiver. These were just the ones that were actually available on the app that I can calculate the fantasy points. So when I have like Jameson Williams at 31, that's not the 31st ranked fantasy player overall. That's 31st among these 31 wide receivers. So just keep that in mind. You have Tyreek and CeeDee Lamb at 1 and 2, unsurprisingly. The first surprise on this list really comes at Mike Evans's expense here, because he is the 19th player off the board in ADP, whereas he has the 8th highest fantasy point total, and he's actually above Puka, which is crazy. And I'll let you guys just kind of sit here and really digest this list a little bit, because there are a ton of discrepancies. Where you have Mike Evans, 8th highest on this list, 19th in underdog ADP. You have Devontae Smith, 12th highest on this list, 20th in underdog ADP. Drake London, 15th in fantasy points, but 10th in underdog ADP. Nico Collins. I mean, this is what Vegas does. They kind of put your numbers on a spectrum, and they try to give you these upside cases, these lower cases. They don't get too high or low on their own supply. You can't just be like, I love Drake London, so let's set his line at 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns. That's out of control. Vegas would lose a fuckload of money doing that because it's unrealistic and unpractical. Can it happen? Yes. We are not fucking robots. This is not black and white. It can happen. It is in the range of outcomes. Like, when you look at a graph of 100% of the possible outcomes, like Drake London finishing with, 1,150 yards and 7 touchdowns is probably in the 90th percentile of like what will likely happen this year, 1,200 yards, whatever. The opposite 10% on both ends are like, okay, 950 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1,450 yards, 11 touchdowns, something like that. Like, of course they can happen, but Vegas kind of puts you into that practical mindset of like, what is the 80th, 90th percentile range of outcomes for these players? Michael Pittman Jr. is up at 16th, but his underdog ADP is 25th. You actually have a lot of discrepancies here. You see a lot of it with the Houston Texans players, which is kind of funny. So you have Nico Collins, 19th in fantasy points, but 12th in ADP, because I think he has a lot of upside, whereas Stephon Diggs, the next player, is 23rd in ADP, and their fantasy points for Vegas is nuts. They are within quite literally 0.1 fantasy points of each other. These are half PPR fantasy points, by the way. So the discrepancy there is large. Jalen Waddle has a big discrepancy. He is 21st in fantasy points, but 13th in ADP. Malik Neighbors is another one where I think they're being practical here. They have him 23rd in fantasy points, but ADP is up at 17 and probably going to be like 15 by the time, the draft season is finally done with us. So I think there's just some to glean here. Like, if you're in a tiebreaker between, Mike Evans and fucking Jalen Waddle, like, maybe you look at the fantasy point totals here per Vegas and say, like, all right, maybe the smarter pick here is a guy like Mike Evans. So I think all these things are useful. All of these data points are helpful to just keep you fucking realistic. And we'll move to the last of the positions, and we have the tight ends. I mean, there's not much to glean here. This was pretty much what I've been saying all summer, was that we have a big 5 tight end in terms of tiers. You have Kelsey at 1, Laporta at 2, Mark Andrews and Trey McBride are tied at 3 and 4, and then Dalton Kincaid is right behind them at 5. And then we have our first big jump-off point, where 6 and 7, David Njoku is actually tied with George Kittle, but David Njoku is the 10th tight end off the board in underdog drafts, while George Kittle is the 6th. So he is tied for 6th. He is 6th ADP. Kyle Pitts is behind them. Kyle Pitts is tied with Jake Ferguson, despite Jake Ferguson being drafted 2 spots later. So David Njoku was kind of like the first real big surprise here. They also have Evan Ingram down multiple spots underneath underdog ADP, and that's kind of a sentiment that I've been saying. So I was kind of happy to see this come to fruition. But again, this is half PPR. So obviously Ingram is a dude coming off of a massive reception season, should be valued higher in full PPR, where a guy like Jake Ferguson might only catch, 60 passes. Evan Ingram can catch 85, 90 passes, and he should be valued accordingly. His touchdown total might be a little bit lower, but in half PPR, he takes a little bit of a dip, but I still think it's useful to see that, like, Jake Ferguson is clearly in the same tier with Evan Ingram, and they're almost saying that he's above him. Jake Ferguson, I don't remember if I have Jake Ferguson above Kyle Pitts in my rankings right now, which, again, can be gotten in our draft guide. The cheapest way to get it, signing up on Underdog. Everything comes back to Underdog. Go get the Travis Kelce line. Go get the draft guide, which has all my draft rankings in it through Underdog. Promo code BDGE when you deposit $10 or more on there. Jake Ferguson, Ingram, Kyle Pitts, pretty much all in the same tier together. George Kittle and David Njoku, only 1 fantasy point higher than Pitts and Ferguson. So they're not much higher either. Something to take into effect. Brock Bowers is where he should be. Goddard's where he should be. Freiermuth's where he should be. Dalton Schultz where he should be. The only other, I guess, kind of standout, and again, this might just be lack of having all of the players on there in this tier, but Chiggy was actually kind of highly ranked here, which was surprising. So he was the 16th highest in terms of fantasy point totals but he's kind of been left for dead in terms of drafting. He's 22nd off the board in tight end ADP, which I kind of agree with. I don't really know what to expect from Chiggy this year. They bring in Calvin Ridley. They have D-Hop, obviously. They bring in Tyler Boyd, Tony Pollard. Like, they have a lot of pass-catching weapons, and Chig just hasn't really shown the upside of being a touchdown scorer or a high-volume player. So I lean more towards the ADP favorite here. But again, maybe this is saying that, like, there's a higher chance of breakout for Chiggy than we are giving credit to. All right, so I hope this video was helpful. I hope this was kind of fun and a little bit of a departure from the normal analysis that we do, where I'm just yapping about players I like and don't like, and we take it from the source, right from the water fountain, straight to our mouth holes. All right, so if I leave you with anything, it's use the lines on Underdog, use the lines in Vegas that push you in the right direction. If you are overshooting on a specific player, you're overly high or you're overly low, come back to reality, okay? So go check out Underdog Fantasy and use our code BDGE if you're first time depositing. Again, you'll get the draft guide, you'll get Travis Kelce's free square, you'll get a deposit match, and you can follow all of my bets, and you can track all of your bets on Pickett, all right? Pickett.com. The Pickett app, absolutely free to use via the mobile app, and you could follow me if you're just using the link down below. I'm out of here. I will see y'all tomorrow.